Good evening. Some people say that tomorrow night in the Cintas Center there is a pretty big deal happening, but I think that this is the place to be this week, right here in Bellarmine Chapel. Yeah. My name is Greg Carpinello, and I serve as the director of the Dorothy Day Center for Faith and Justice here at Xavier University. Welcome to Bellarmine Chapel and to our campus if you are visiting. In the Center for Faith and Justice, or the CFJ, as many students know it, our primary motivation, I would say, could be classified as what Peter Hans Kolvenbach, former superior general of the Jesuits, called pursuing a faith that does justice. In other words, our CFJ staff and our student leaders work year in and year out to engage Xavier students in programming that helps them grow in faith, to serve the world around them, and to seek the common good in a very diverse and complex world. Here in 2016, I believe it's a challenge to pursue a faith that does justice when there are such loud voices in our world that preach power, exclusion, individualism, and a winner-take-all mentality. In such an environment, voices that do sing out for peace, justice, and compassion can be wellsprings for our movements that attempt to change the world into a place where all people might flourish. We're lucky enough to have one of those voices, I believe, one of those wellsprings with us tonight for an evening of storytelling and conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce Father Greg Boyle, founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles and author of the book Tattoos on the Heart. A bit about Father Greg. After attending and graduating from St. Brendan School and Loyola High School, he entered the Order of the Society of Jesus and was ordained a priest in 1984. In 1986, he was appointed pastor of Dolores Mission in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, where he served through 1992. Homeboy Industries traces its roots back to 1988, when, in an effort to address the escalating problems and unmet needs of gang-involved youth, Father Greg and other community members developed positive alternatives, including establishing an elementary school, a daycare program, and finding legitimate employment for young people. In 1992, as a response to the civil unrest in Los Angeles, Father Greg launched the first social enterprise business, Homeboy Bakery. The mission of the Homeboy models of social enterprise is to create an environment that provides training, work experience, and above all, the opportunity for rival gang members to work side by side. This work ultimately led Father Greg to write Tattoos on the Heart, a book that has gone on to receive widespread acclaim for its powerful stories and poignant insights into who God is and how God sees us. So tonight, please join me in welcoming Greg to our community so that we might all join together in the next step on our journeys of recognizing God in our midst and our journeys of pursuing a faith that does justice.
Thank you very much. I apologize if the tickets you received for this event this evening you thought was going to be for the game tomorrow, but oh well, you're here and we're all here. Feels like I was just here. I don't know when that was, over a year ago, I guess, or something. So I apologize if you've heard me before. I mean, it changes a little bit, but once I spoke at a foster grandparent gathering, a huge gathering in Southern California. Well, I had spoken at it just the summer before, and it was exactly the same foster grandparents who were listening to me again. And afterwards, this old grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked the talk. She had big tears in her eyes, and she grabbed both my hands, and she said, "I heard you last year. It never gets better." So, kind of hoping she misspoke there, but probably not. So thanks, students and everybody else here from this community, this great community, for your attention. You know, folks on the margins are just hoping for folks to pay some attention. I had a very earnest 16-year-old gang member stand in front of my desk, and he said, "Look, I need your divided attention." I said, "You are in luck, because that is exactly what you'll be getting." You know, I'm going home tomorrow. I've been on the road a lot. I am homesick. And so it'll be nice to be there for a little while, which I'm planning to do. You know, and the day won't ever come when I am closer to God or have more courage or am more noble than the thousands of men and women I've come to know over the 30 years I've worked with gang members. People like Luis Perez, who there's a kind of a core group of about 4 homies who run the place. And they do everything from personnel, and it's you know, you might have the head baker who's kind of in charge of the bakery, but these are the guys who really run the place, and they went up through the ranks, and you know, now they're in charge, and it's nice to be away, because then they use muscles that they probably wouldn't use otherwise. So Lewis is kind of a force of nature, and so he does a lot of things, and he knows how to read these folks really well. Heroin addict himself, and gang member, shot caller, been to prison, tattooed, but he's also become something of a speaker in his own right, and even he helps me give retreats, and he's sort of into the Ignatian thing, which is kind of really interesting to watch him. You know, he thinks Ignatius is some original gangster of some kind, you know, but he's become quite a good speaker, and so he's been we went out to dinner the other night, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he says, you know, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That is good. That's some good advice there. So brace yourselves. You know, so there's a vision that brings you here this evening, and that's the whole point of those of you who are students here, of course, is that what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said of your time here at Xavier. It's not the place you come to, it's the place you go from, and you don't leave here without having your life somehow altered radically with a vision, you know, a vision of wanting the world to look differently than it currently looks. The prophet Habakkuk writes, the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it. But we don't want to wait around. You know, we want to kind of make something happen. And of course, Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills, I think, correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other, so we try to stand against forgetting that. We try to imagine a circle of compassion, and then we imagine nobody standing outside that circle. We seek, in our own particularity, to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And so we stand at the margins, as Pope Francis courageously, prophetically, wonderfully invites us. And it's like he has a thesaurus, you know, but peripheries, margins, edges, outskirts. You know, he keeps trying to underscore this notion that something profound will happen if you go out to the margins. First of all, you look under your feet and you'll discover that the margins are getting erased precisely because you decided to stand there. And then you stand in a particular way with folks who Jesus invites us to accompany: the poor, the powerless, the voiceless, those whose dignity has been denied, those whose burdens are more than they can bear, the easily despised, the readily left out. You stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. So that's God's dream come true, I think, which is a community of kinship, such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And I'm a big believer in byproduct, you know. The byproduct of our efforts of creating a community of kinship is, in fact, peace, justice, and equality. Part of our difficulty is that we've focused on those singularly wonderful goals, and they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other. This is as God intended it, it seems to me. The most essential thing is that we want to kind of figure out what is on God's mind. What kind of God do we have? There's a Jesuit brother of mine who always says, we need a better God than the one we have. And I think that's actually quite true. We allow our God to sort of atrophy a little bit. Even now, we're in Lent, you know, and you kind of, the church will talk about things like Lenten observance. You know, well, what are you supposed to observe? You know, what we get stuck back in this time, like the third grade, where don't eat meat on Fridays and fast and abstain and sacrifice and don't eat chocolate, whatever the heck that means, and give stuff up. We couldn't possibly believe that this is something that God has any interest in. God doesn't want folks to give stuff up. God just wants us to give into tenderness. God's tenderness trying to reach us. The other day I ran into a homegirl named Lisa, and she said, well, I discovered my man, he's been cheating on me. So I went to church. It was Ash Wednesday. I got me them ashes. I gave his ass up for Lent. Well, there's a Lenten observance for you, you know. But what are we supposed to observe, you know? We're supposed to somehow understand, as St. Ignatius of Loyola always says, the God who's always greater. You know, how do we get to that place where we know this God, the God who loves us without measure and without regret, the God who's too busy loving us to have any time left for anything else? You know, I was thinking Yogi Berra died recently, and the homies out yogi, you know, I mean, they're just the way they mangle the English language, it's always eternally charming. I had a homegirl come in, bringing in her man to introduce him to me, and she says, this is my sufficient other. No doubt. You know, recently I had my CEO named a CEO to kind of take over the operation, because it's like $18 million annual operation. What do I know from running an $18 million annual operation? So he's a businessman, and it's been nice to have him take over. But I had a homeboy in my office, and he said, damn, Gene, my lady, she is in a bad mood. And I said, why? Well, you know, she's beginning her administration period. I said, well, you know, I'm ending mine, so kind of know what she's going through. But my favorite one came when I was at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and I was presiding there in a big gym, all kids locked up, mainly gang members, about 300 kids. And so, you know, I was sitting down, and you know how you do it when you preside, you kind of say, well, I'm going to close my eyes and just listen to the reading. And I had the little hoja, the sheet on my lap that had all the readings. And so I closed my eyes. I was letting the word of God sort of enter me. And this kid got up with over an abundance of confidence, I think. And he said, the Lord is exhausted. And I said, what the hell? And it said, the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. You know, because if you think about it, exalted is sort of to lift up, to elevate, to goodbye, you know, it's way up there. When who in the world would think that that was ever on God's mind? I mean, it's a total projection that we're creating God in our own image. I would want to be exalted. I'll be honest with you. I would want to be way up there. When, of course, all God wants to do is to be close and intimate and whispering. And it's like when you do this, you know, when you, somebody says, how do you feel? I'm exhausted. But it's a good tired. You've heard this. Why? Well, you know, I helped a friend move into her apartment. Oh, I had the grandkids all weekend. It's a good tired. I'm exhausted, but it's a good tired. It's about exhausting yourself in cherishing another. That's way better than this exalted, distant God. And I think that's sort of important because all those things matter. I was thinking recently with Justice Scalia dying, may he rest in peace, but he had a kind of notion of you know, the law and originalism and the death penalty. And he felt that Christians were obliged to follow Jesus and be forgiving, but felt that the state had a kind of a God-given right to express wrath to evildoers by executing people. And that's only because you have a certain sense of a God who is wrathful. And I think nothing could be further from the kind of God we have. We need a better God than the one we have. I was reading recently that Whoopi Goldberg was interviewed in a magazine, a Q&A, and they asked her, what living person do you most admire? And she said, Pope Francis. And then she said, yeah, he's going with the original program. And I thought, wow, out of the mouth of Whoopi. Because that's everybody in this room wants to kind of go with the original program. You know what it is. You want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. But you can't take seriously what Jesus took seriously unless you know what it is. And that's part of our exploration as people who want to move from a child consciousness of God to an adult consciousness. That what mattered to Jesus was inclusion and nonviolence and unconditional loving kindness and acceptance. And that's where we want to be ourselves. So there was a homie named Louis who was working in our 18-month program, and he told me once, all I ever wanted to be was the biggest, baddest gang member in town. And then he paused and he looked at me and he said, I was disguised as that guy. So he finished the 18-month program at Homeboy, which is sort of the centerpiece, and then we found him a better job elsewhere. And before he left, this doesn't happen all the time, but at our morning meeting, he said, can I say something to the other trainees? And I said, sure. And he gets up and he looks at all the trainees who are all gang members, rival gang members who were there for the 18-month time. He said, all of you are diamonds covered in dust. You can wipe your dust off here, he says. Well, several months later, it's a Saturday, I'm at the detention facilities where I say Mass on a rotating basis, and I'm looking at my cell phone, and he says, hey, G, do me a favor. My refrigerator died, can you help me out? So by the time I got around to the message, I said, okay, Sears, 4 o'clock, and he texts me back, beers at 4 o'clock, he says, you know, Louis got jokes. So I go to the Sears, a big iconic Sears in Boyle Heights, and I see him in the appliance section. When he catches sight of me, he gallops towards me, and he gives me a big bear hug in the middle of aisle 5, you know, and as he's putting me down, I said, have they called security on your ass yet? And he said, it's only a matter of time, he says. So we buy a little refrigerator on the installment plan, and then I drive him home to a humble little place where for the first time in his life he's paying rent with honestly clean earned money. And he hesitates to get out of the car. And he says, hey, can I tell you something? I said, sure. You know, lately I've been having one-on-ones with, God. And he turns and he looks at me and he says, and the dude shows up, which I kind of chuckle and think is charming until I see that his eyes are welling up with tears, and he says, why would he do that? After all the shit I've caused. Why would he do that? We need a better God than the one we have. The one that invites us to a sense of kinship and connection with each other. The one that wants us to obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate. Homies have taught me so much in the last 30 years, and I'm eternally grateful to them. But in the last few years, they've taught me how to text. I was madly texting in Mike's office back there, and I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people, and I'm pretty good at it. LOL and OMG and BTW, and the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately, so I know I can't be alone in being vexed by this stupid autocorrect thing, So I have a homegirl named Bertha on a Sunday. She says, where are you at? So I text her back, I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas, and monjas is Spanish for nuns, sisters, about to speak to a room full of monjas. I pushed send, and autocorrect told her I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas. Which she thought was pretty interesting, The worst one, the homies are always calling me with their hair on fire and, the lights are going to get cut off. And if some kid needed some money to completar su renta, to finish up his rent, and I just didn't have it. So I wrote, things are tight. I pushed send. Thongs are tight. Yeah. He texts me back, sorry to hear that. What about my rent? Anyway, so I'm in a car with two older homies, older vatos, Manuel and Poncho, and we're going to drive to a school to speak at high school. And their older vatos been tattooed, do a variety of things at Homeboy, and we meet right after our morning meeting, and they get in the car. Manuel's in the front seat, and we're 50 minutes on the road when he gets an incoming text, and he reads it to himself and he chuckles. And I said, what is it? He goes, oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I'd just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazote as the day was beginning, and Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers, and it's a tough job because occasionally gang members can be attitudinal. So I said, well, what's he saying? He goes, oh, hang on, it's dumb. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, and then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other, because I remember. And now they shoot text messages. And the word for that is kinship. How do we allow ourselves to consider the notion that there is no us and them, there's just us? There's distance everywhere. and God hopes we'll bridge it. In this recent kerfuffle between Donald Trump and the Pope, and people got their jonies in a knot. I just why is the Pope inserting in American politics? He's answering a question in the back of the plane. And show of hands, if you agree with this statement. Jesus prefers bridge building to wall building. Well, of course, there you go. Well, none of you agree with that? There you go. Yes, of course. And it's like it's not a hard one. But this is clearly what's on God's mind, is to somehow bridge this distance. Even in service, there's a distance in service that you want to bridge. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all in a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. In fact, it's the difference between humility and hubris. Humility says, I need healing. And hubris says, I am the healer. And you kind of don't ever want to get anywhere near there. As they say in 12-step programs, without humility and honesty, you can't make progress. You can't really move forward. And you certainly can't move toward kinship. But service is good. Start at service, but don't end in service, because service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, the place of exquisite mutuality, where you're not saving people and you're not even helping people. That's the choice always, is not to save the world. What you're being asked to do is savor the world. People ask me, how do you reach gang members? I go, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? I think that's the only question. I only want to be reached. I know it sounds selfish. A PBS reporter at the end of an interview said, how's it feel to have saved thousands and thousands of lives? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. My life is saved every day. It's a little bit like John Sobrino's book that says, no salvation outside the poor. So in the original covenant, the original program, when the covenant between God and God's people was quite simple. As I have loved you, of course we all expect the end of that sentence to read, love me back, but God doesn't say that. As I have loved you, so must you have a particular preferential special love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And why would God isolate those three? Well, because God knows that those three groupings of the poor know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they've suffered that particular suffering, God thinks they're trustworthy to guide us to the birth of a new inclusion. And I think that's quite right. There's a homegirl named Nellie who I've known for a long time, and you'd be hard-pressed to find something that she hasn't endured. Gang member, prostitute, drug addict, tattooed, felon, parolee. She's suffered that particular suffering of having your kids taken from you and raised by strangers. Growing up, she was surrounded by terror and torture and violence and abuse. I know that I would not have survived one day of her childhood. One day she's in my office and she's just kind of leaning at the front of the desk, and maybe she's there for some help of some kind, like paying this or giving her money for food for her refrigerator. She's famously a chillona, which means she's very sensitive. She always cries. She looks at me and she says, "Damn, G, I wish you were God." I said, "Why?" And she starts to cry and she says, "I think you'd let me into heaven." And then it was my turn to be chillon. And I reached across the expanse of my desk and I grabbed both her hands and I pulled her in close, and we were looking into each other's tear-filled eyes. And I said, "Nellie, I swear to you, if I get to heaven and you're not there, I'm not staying. And the day won't ever come when I am more noble, or I have more courage, or I am closer to God than Nellie. My life is saved every day I show up at that place." Homeboy was started when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. Had the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole world was my parish, 8 gangs at war with each other. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988 and buried my 202nd a month ago. Did a lot of things. We started a school first because there were so many middle school age gang members kicked out, given the boot. No school wanted them, so I'd walk out to them in the projects and I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, they all said, "Yeah." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so it forced my hand. And across the street from the church is our parochial school, grades K to 8, first 2 floors. But the third floor was the convent where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns together in the living room and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they said, "Sure." So anyway, long story short, gang members came in large numbers to the church, not to church services, but to property. And which created something of a disconnect. People, thought, wow, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in, bad people out. So that was a good gospel challenge. And then the gang members said if only we had jobs. And so we, myself and the women, because it was mainly single mothers with kids in the projects, only women really. And we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we invented these crews, a crew to build a child care center, a graffiti removal crew, landscaping, maintenance. And then the unrest happened in '92, and the bottom sort of fell out of the city. The place was ignited. But our community didn't, and so the LA Times wanted to know why. And I suppose this was self-serving, but I said, well, I think our community didn't explode because we had 60 strategically hired gang members who were invested. And so they didn't torch the place. Movie producer named Ray Stark with $500 million read the article, summoned me, and said, what should I do with my money? And I said, well, why don't you buy this abandoned bakery across the street from the church? It has ovens. We'll put hairnets on rival gang members. We'll have them bake bread. I don't know, we'll call it Homeboy Bakery. So that was the extent of my business plan, which drives my board crazy. So, and he said, sure, so we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we have plural, we changed our names from Jobs for Our Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. And not everything worked. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And people walk into our headquarters now, almost 30 years later, and say, how'd you think this up? And the truth is you don't. You sort of back your way into something. You evolve your way. You try to respond as best you can each day to stuff. And so now we've backed our way into becoming the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So there are about 15,000 folks a year who walk through our doors. The 18-month program is our centerpiece. Curriculum items, everybody goes to classes while they're working. Anger management, parenting, we still have a school. Free tattoo removal, no place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. And we have 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, and we have 47 volunteer doctors. I don't know how many thousands of treatments they perform a year. So if any of you are starting to regret that X tattoo you have, please see me later. It was all started because of a guy named Frank who wandered into my office 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison. I'd never met him before, and he's sitting in front of my desk, and pardon my language, but tattooed on his forehead it said, "Fuck the world." And he said, I am having a hard time finding a job. And I said, well, now, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one, And so naturally, I hired him, and so he bagged bread for a couple of years, and I found a doctor at White Memorial Hospital who was willing to donate an hour a month from his laser machine to chip away at Frank's forehead and a few others. And before too long at all, I had 3,000 gang members who wanted this service, which was incredible. The list was so long, so we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. A parenthesis, Frank is now a security guard at a movie studio in Hollywood, and there is no trace of the angriest, dumbest thing he had ever done. Proving once and for all, as Sister Helen Prejean says, all of us are a whole lot more than the worst things we've ever done. And so we have all our training programs, solar installation training program, and all our businesses, the bakery, the silk screen, 2 restaurants at LAX airport, Homeboy Grocery, which is where we sell chips and salsas, and all the Ralph's store, which is the Kroger chain. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. It's a who's who. If you've ever gone there, it's a place where you're always going to run into a celeb or an elected official in Los Angeles. Jim Carrey comes there for lunch, and it's really quite pandemonium when he does. And Jack Black, the actor, and all the Dodgers came once. And some months ago, with only 2 hours notice, the Secret Service called and said that Vice President Joe Biden wanted to have lunch there. So, the motorcade and the entourage, and he was getting selfies with all the homies, I wasn't there. I was making my annual 8-day silent retreat. So when I came home, Louis Mora, one of the homies, he was debriefing me. While you were gone, we were visited by an MVP. I go, do you mean a VIP? That one, VIP. Yeah. Damn, gee, imagine here at Homeboy Industries, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. I swear to you, I would never have made that up. And we're thinking of adding a current affairs class to our curriculum. But most famous of all was Diane Keaton, who showed up with a regular, and a guy who was there once a week. And her waitress is Glinda, and Glinda's a big girl, home girl, tattooed, been to prison, felon. She has no idea who Diane Keaton is, and so Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glinda rattles off the 3 dishes she particularly likes, and And Diane Keaton says, I'll have that second one. That one sounds good. And well, it's at that moment something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. Like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton says, oh, gosh, she deflects it humbly. I suppose I have one of those faces, that people think they've seen before, And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Wow, that just took my breath away. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And God communicates to us through Jesus, who says clearly to the gathered, that you may be one. All of us are called to that kind of kinship and connection. And we're called to be what Alice Miller called enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy Industries, we're sort of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking people to measure up. We think, just hold the mirror up and tell people the truth. And you discover that my truth is your truth, and your truth is a gang member's truth, and it all happens to be the same truth. And here's the truth. You're exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce that. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. Well, part of our task at Homeboy is to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The goal, of course, is to be able to, as Acts of the Apostles say, and awe came upon everyone. How do you get to a place where we can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, instead of standing in judgment at how they carry it? I call Homeboy sometimes, it's a place, it's like the Discovery Channel. People are always discovering things. A homie named Jermaine, who was 30 years old, came into my office not long ago, and he retrieved a memory from the time that he was 9 years old. He was in bed, and his mother opens the door, and he can see her standing in the doorway, backlit by the hall light, and he's trying to bring some focus to seeing her. And she's not saying anything, but her arms are outstretched, and her wrists are deeply and profoundly slashed, and blood is coursing on the floor. And she says to her 9-year-old kid, "See what you made me do." And the next day, he was taken from her care and put in foster care. His other 2 siblings were left in her care, only underscoring the worst kind of message imaginable. And he was put in foster homes and got into a gang at 13, and at 17, he was raised by the prison system. Anyway, he retrieved that memory at Homeboy Industries in a community of tenderness. And he's sobbing in my office, and he said, "I discovered something today, that I had preferred my rage to my shame." And because he had made that discovery in this community of tenderness, he was able to forgive his mother for having been mentally ill, and forgive himself for having once been a 9-year-old boy. At Homeboy, everybody there is required to make friends and welcome their own wound, because if you don't, you'll be tempted to despise the wounded. and awe came upon everyone. Let me end with this story so that I can entertain some of your questions. But we began with the Lenten observance. And what kind of Lenten observance does God have any interest in? I was interviewed on the Christian Broadcasting Network by a nice Christian lady who was asking me what we do at Homeboy, and I did the list as I did previously with you, from tattoo removal to therapy to employment services to training. And the list was long, and when I was done, she made a face like maybe she had smelled something foul. And she said, "Yeah, but how much time each day at Homeboy Industries do you spend praising God?" And I said, "All damn day." I don't believe she liked that answer. Which leads me to this final story. So sometimes it occurs to universities to force their students to read my book. I'm not complaining. And so my alma mater, Gonzaga, who's doing very badly in basketball for the very first time in a long time. So they invited me, and I said, sure, I'll go. And they said, bring 2 homies with you. And I always bring homies if people are willing to pay for them to fly out here. And I pick them always in the same way. I always get enemies so that they will, have to share a hotel room together just to mess with them, And then I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing them panicked in the sky. Recently, I went to Washington, D.C., and I had 2 older homies who had never been on a plane, and one at LAX, the homie was saying, "Are we flying Virgin Airlines because this is our first time?" Dead serious. So I picked these 2 homies. Bobby, African-American gang member, worked in the bakery, and Mario, this tall drink of water who works in our merchandise store. And I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times. I've never flown with anybody more terrified of flying than this kid Mario. I mean, he was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet. So we're at Burbank Airport, which is a small airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines mainly, and they don't have that hermetically sealed deal, chute. You have to walk out onto the tarmac, and you climb up onto the steps to the front of the plane, or the back of the plane, which is the big feature at Burbank. And so we're sitting there waiting, and Mario's sitting next to me, and our plane arrives. I go, "There's our plane." I thought, oh my God, he's going to die before we walk up those stairs. And so I see our 2 flight attendants, females, both have large cups of Starbucks coffee in their hands, and the 2 of them are schlepping up the front steps to get on the plane. And Mario goes, "When are we going to board the plane?" I go, "As soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. All right, maybe I shouldn't have said that, So I should tell you that Mario, probably in the history of Homeboy Industries, most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is saying a lot. He's all sleeved out, and his neck is blackened with tattoos, and face covered in tattoos, head shaved tattoos, and so I'd never been in public with him, so I'm walking in the airport, and people are, oh my God, doing this and holding their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't that something? Because if you went tomorrow to Homeboy Industries and said, name the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they wouldn't say me. They'd say Mario. He's just so kind and gentle. He embodies tenderness. Even for as terrified as he was on the plane, the flight attendant would hand him peanuts, and he wouldn't just take them and wouldn't just thank her. He grabbed her hand and looked her in the eye and, "Thank you so much," just over the top. So we get to Gonzaga, and a lot of times this happens where they'll say you have one big talk on Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is you have 9 other talks that you're going to do. They didn't tell you this part. So it's class, lunch, class, meeting, class. So I tell Bobby and Mario, I'm not going to speak at any of these. You guys will. I'll sit in the back of the classroom. And so they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did a good job. And their stories were, again, stories of torture and abuse and neglect and violence and abandonment. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. So the big talk came at night, and it was like 2,000 people. It was an incredible place, packed, standing room only, students sitting on the floor. So I told them, I said, look, I want you two to get up first, do a little 5-minute snapshot of your life so that you can be included in the question and answer afterwards. And they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did it, and they did a good job. I did my thing. And they said, okay, well, let me open it up then. And yes, ma'am. So a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out of the gates for Mario. So he walks up to the podium and hangs onto the microphone. Yes. And he's just terrified, and he's trembling, and I'm standing behind him. And the woman says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a teenage daughter and a teenage son, or they're both about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he grabs the microphone and he's trembling and can feel like he's starting to kind of become overwhelmed emotionally, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with the answer. And when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those two words, he retreats back into his closed-eyed gripping of the microphone, and he's trembling, and now he's really starting to buckle under the emotional weight of this, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she looks at Mario and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself. And they in turn were returned to themselves in exquisite mutuality. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. And our Lenten observance couldn't be more pure if it looked like that. You stand at the margins because you hope against hope that by standing there, they'll get erased. And you brace yourself because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We don't give stuff up at Lent. We give in to God's tenderness. And then those voices can be heard because we've chosen to be in the world who God is. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, we wait for it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Let's just we'll just do 10 minutes or so question, and like raise your hand. I go like that. I'll repeat the question if you're meek. Extra credit for students. Yes.
I was wondering what advice you would give to a lot of crappier college students in their pursuit in the future of pursuing a life of kinship and solidarity with faith.
Yeah, advice. Well, I don't know. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. And most famously, a reporter had commented to him once, "Wow, these farm workers sure love you." And Cesar shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And that's the hope. The more you can move quickly to mutuality, it's all relational. Jean Vanier, who I notice you have a book out there by him, and who's the founder of the L'Arche community, says that the highest form of spiritual maturity is tenderness. And I think part of the reason he says that is because if love is the answer, we always say at Homeboy, community is the context, but tenderness is the methodology, because otherwise love stays in the air or the ether, or it stays in your head, or it stays in your heart. But unless it becomes tenderness, there is no connective tissue to it. There is no transformation possible unless it becomes tenderness. This is why it's so essential, it seems to me, to give in to the tenderness of God. It's the only thing God wants. God wants to exhaust God's self in communicating that message, as opposed to a distant, exalted, way up there God. So unless our love becomes tenderness, it doesn't connect, and connecting is everything. And so then you avoid this one-way street, as opposed to the two-way street, which is this great moment. I sort of don't believe in depletion. People always talk to me, "Oh my God, how do you do it? How do you restore? How do you take care of yourself?" All that kind of stuff. I get it, but I sort of don't believe it. I don't believe in depletion. If you feel depleted, then you're probably not doing it right, in the sense that, it's about saving the world instead of savoring it. Instead of saving the world, what if we just wondered, how's he doing? Suddenly it becomes very tender and very close and very intimate. And of course, the byproduct of our tenderness is that the world will absolutely, utterly change. See, that's the thing. The minute you want to fight racism, welcome to total frustration. But the minute you want to kind of stand with people and receive people, 30 years ago, I was privileged to take a class taught by Henry Nouwen and Parker Palmer at Harvard Divinity, and it was a class on ministry, and Nouwen was sort of going through a hard time. It was before he kind of discovered the L'Arche communities. But he said, "I don't know, ministry is just, can you receive people?" That's what he said, And I agree with that. I think that's the truth. Can you just receive people? Because if you receive people or allow yourself to be reached by the poor, watch what happens. It is hugely ennobling and empowering. And the poor folks feel valuable because you chose to receive them rather than fix them. This side. Yes, way back there.
The talk seems to focus a lot more on the symptoms of the injustices that you're fighting. And I often find that social justice work, to be effective, it oscillates between the causes, the symptoms, and the causes of the things we're fighting. So my question is, how do you address many of the cultural, economic, and systemic issues that create the people that come to your doors to begin with?
Yeah, good question. I think there are three profiles of kids who join gangs, and they're kids who are despondent, who can't imagine a future for themselves, so their present isn't very compelling. And if your present doesn't compel you, you won't care whether you inflict harm, and you won't care whether you duck to get out of harm's way. That's the first profile. The second profile is the traumatized, damaged kid like Jermaine and countless others, Nellie. Are folks who are traumatized, and so they can't see their way clear to transform their pain, so they keep transmitting it. And the third profile of the kid who joins a gang is a mentally ill kid. If we believe that, it has nothing to do with morality at all, which is the good news. Nothing to do with good, right and wrong at all, because it's all indicators. Gang violence is a language, and we'd do well to try to figure out what language is that violence speaking. And if we believe that to be true, as I would bet my entire life that it's true, then you would infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign, and you would help heal the traumatized, and you would deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way. But it has nothing to do with good people or bad people. It only has to do with more people have to carry more than others. And this is why John Sobrino writes a book that's provocatively titled, No Salvation Outside the Poor. Because your entire salvation rests on that relationship. It rests on being able to stand at the margins. The problem comes when we try to sort of address the sinful social structures way up here somewhere. Oh, I know, that'll handle this way down here. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. And I think it doesn't matter how singularly focused you could well be on all those other things. If there isn't some undergirding sense of kinship, if you foster kinship, the byproduct of that will be things will work themselves out. Otherwise, we stay in our head and we try to address issues. And Jesus didn't take the right stand on issues. He chose to stand in the right place. St. Ignatius in the spiritual exercises, in the meditation on the two standards, says, see Jesus standing in the lowly place. He's not pointing at you to get your butt over in the lowly place, no. He's not wagging his finger at you. He's standing in the lowly place. And that's sort of the way it works. If enough people of faith do what Pope Francis is suggesting, which is to go to the margins, watch what happens, watch how things get unsettled. I'm going to just close with one story, a recent thing that happened to me. There are some homies that you keep in the recesses of your mind, and you don't acknowledge this, but you'll say, yeah, I'm not so sure this guy's going to be able to turn this ship around, you know. Those are always the few handful of homies who end up running Homeboy Industries, you know, who become, you know, home runs, you know. But you still kind of go, ooh, I don't know, the degree of difficulty here is high. One such kid was a kid named Danny, who I met at 13. I met him in the streets, into his neighborhood, into his gang, hard-headed, was allergic to ever walking through the doors at Homeboy. In fact, told me, I'm never walking in there. Suit yourself. Then I met him again and again and again, locked up in juvenile hall and probation camps, and finally he went to prison at 18 and was there 2 years. When he got out at 20, his mom was dying of cancer, 6 months to live, and he sat by her bedside, and I watched him there with great tenderness until she died. and I buried her. And a week after that, he was in my office for the very first time in his life. And he's currently working at Homeboy. He's been there now 6 months. So the other day, he comes into my office and he says, "What happened to me last night has never happened to me in my life." He tells me that he was on the Gold Line, so there's a train across the street from Homeboy, Chinatown Station. You take it east, he's going home. He's in a car that's packed, but he got a seat. Standing right in front of him, hanging onto a pole, he says, is a medio pedo guy, a guy who's a little bit drunk. A homie, he says, older guy, he can see his tattoos, he doesn't know who he is. And Danny is sitting there, and Danny is wearing a t-shirt, huge t-shirt, that says, Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy is hanging onto the pole, and he looks at Danny and says, "Hey, you work there?" And Danny doesn't know whether to engage him, so he just sort of says, nods, yes. "It any good?" Danny sort of shrugs and says, "I don't know. It's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'll ever go back to prison because of this place." And he points at his shirt. And then Danny stands up and he fishes in his pocket and he finds a piece of paper, and then he gets a pen and he starts to write for the guy the address at Homeboy Industries. And as he's telling me this story, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." And he finishes writing it and he hands it to the guy and he says, "Come see us. We'll help you." And the guy studies the piece of paper and he says, "Thank you." And the train stops and the guy gets off. And Danny sits down and he says, "What happened to me next has never happened in my life." And he says that everyone on the train is looking at him, and everyone on the train is nodding at him, and everyone on the train is smiling at him. And now he can barely speak. He's getting so filled with emotion. And he says, "For the first time in my life, I felt admired." I don't know what got solved there. A sinful social structure. All I know is knowing him has saved my life. And I think if we inch ourselves closer and closer to connection, to tender holding of each other, to an unshakable belief that there is no us and them, that there's just us. If we stand with the widow, orphan, and the stranger, knowing that they know what it's like to have been cut off, and therefore they are trustworthy to guide the rest of us to the birth of a new inclusion. Thank you all very much.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, I thank you, Father Greg, for your words and your message. Something he started with very early on tonight was, I love this image that, Xavier or Bellarmine Parish isn't the place that we come to, it's the place where we go from. And I think our hope for this event tonight is just one of those ways in which you might not come to something, but go forth from something. And on that note, just an encouragement for all of you as you think about what's on your heart tonight and how you've been moved by these stories and this message. What is that invitation for you in your own life? How is that God inviting you into something deeper or more tender or more loving in your own life. For Bellarmine, Tim Severin on staff here will be in the back to talk about opportunities that might be available to you going forward. And if you're a Xavier student, there will be some students who are volunteering to pass out some sheets in the narthex that just have a few suggestions about what that might look like for you as you go forth from this place. But let's give Father Greg one more round of applause. And thank you for coming, and have a great night.